الحديث الخبراء التالي بعنوان آلية تعديل حدود الكربون في مواجهة التغيرات المناخية Cbam. المتحدث الأستاذ دان ماليسكي، كبير مستشاري Cbam ومستشار الأسواق البيئية.
Hello and good afternoon. My name is Dan Maleski. I'm with REDSHAW Advisors. I lead our EU Cbam consultancy and advisory team. Today we'll be talking about the acronym I'm sure everyone's hearing a lot about, the EU Cbam. The goal of today is for everyone to have a few takeaways, primarily why this mechanism was introduced, how it works, and lastly the implications it will have on Egypt, on Turkey, and the rest of MENA's exporters into the EU. To begin with, to give you an appetizer per se of why Cbam matters. Later on in this presentation, I'll be showing a handful of forecasts we've done in preparation for this event, one of which is talking about cement exported from Egypt into the EU. We came away with the perspective that by 2034, for 1 ton of cement exported into the EU, that cost will increase by 556%. We've done forecasts for fertilizer and aluminum, but I just wanted to set the scene of why this policy matters so much. Before we begin, I wanted to briefly introduce REDSHAW Advisors. We are an environmental markets consultancy. We work with both public and private institutions alike. We've consulted with the EU, the UK government, South Korea, Australia on their carbon market design. We also work with around 300 of Europe's industrials on the EU ETS as well as on the voluntary carbon markets. The 3 pillars, what we do is we inform, which is what I'll be doing today, discussing legislation, discussing market-moving events. We advise. Every company arrives some way, somehow, at a fork in the road, where there could be a decision and another decision. What we do is we advise on the risks and opportunities associated with both decisions. And lastly, we procure. We can provide a route to both the primary and secondary European compliance carbon markets, as well as the voluntary carbon markets. So I mentioned I'm going to be telling the story of the EU Cbam, why it exists. And to tell the story, we need to begin all the way back in 2004. Don't worry, I'll go quick with this one. We won't be taking too much time, but we need to talk about the EU ETS if we want to talk about the EU Cbam. Without the EU ETS, there would be no EU Cbam. The EU ETS stands for the European Union Emissions Trading System. This is widely seen as the most successful and largest compliance carbon market in the world. Each day, around 300 to 400 million euros is traded on the secondary exchange of this market. Nearly 10,000 companies are exposed. Exposed meaning they are forced to participate. Many of our clients pay upwards of 100 million to 200 million euros a year on this market. The way this market operates is it's commoditized carbon. It says that industry, if you want to pollute, that's fine, but you need to pay for your pollution. The way you pay for your pollution is by procuring 1 ton of carbon. That ton of carbon is called an acronym, an EUA, European Union Allowance, because it's allowing you to emit carbon. Currently, 1 EUA, as of today, is around 55 euros. I say around because this is a market. Markets move up, markets move down. To give you a flavor of how volatile this market was, about 9 months ago, 1 EUA was north of 100 euros. Now it's 55. This market moves quite rapidly. As I mentioned, about 20 million tons of carbon is traded a day on the secondary exchange. So the peaks and troughs can be upwards of 5 to 10%, either intraday or intra-week. So this is widely seen as an incredible success for European industry. It's helped them decarbonize, but there's been one major flaw with this mechanism. That flaw is called carbon leakage. Carbon leakage is when companies try and circumvent a strong cost of carbon. They do this by relocating to jurisdictions that don't have a cost of carbon. So let's say I'm a steel manufacturer in Germany, and let's say I emit 1 million tons of carbon a year, which is quite modest for most steel manufacturers. So with 1 EUA being 55 euros, if I emit 1 million tons of carbon, that means every year I have a bill of 55 million euros to buy carbon. I might not want to do that. That's quite expensive. So what I might look to do is to move my manufacturing plant from Germany, for example, maybe to Egypt or Turkey or China, a jurisdiction that does not have a cost of carbon, therefore saving a significant amount of capital. Now this has happened in cement, it's happened in aluminum, it's happened in every sector exposed to the EU ETS. And this is where our conversation of the EU Cbam starts. The initial mechanism that the EU ETS used to mitigate carbon leakage is called free allocation. And free allocation is exactly what it sounds like. Free allocation is the EU providing free allowances to industry to mitigate carbon leakage. But intrinsically, this mechanism is not permanent. It's temporary. It's always been temporary. It's a Band-Aid. The permanent solution to carbon leakage, and why I'm here today, is to discuss what the EU has decided to move forward with. The EU will be incorporating a border carbon adjustment. A border carbon adjustment, or a Cbam, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, is when the home country, such as the EU, requires for the embedded emissions of goods imported into its jurisdiction to be measured, reported, verified, and finally procured. What this means is the EU ETS no longer does not stop at the borders of the EU. The EU ETS and its requirements will cover all importers into Europe. So let's say we're in Egypt right now. Let's say I'm a fertilizer manufacturer in Egypt, and I'm selling in Italy. With the EU Cbam, starting back on October 31st of 2023, only a few months ago, for every ton of embedded emissions that I export into the EU, I need to measure and report it. The reporting aspect of it is incredibly comprehensive. We mentioned and we talked earlier about EPDs. We talked earlier about ISOs. The EU Cbam uses its own methodology, and the methodology it employs is incredibly rigorous. Most of our clients are hiring and employing entire teams of people, 10 to 15 people, simply to comply with this. The reporting aspect is quite incredible, and that's only the reporting aspect. As I mentioned, you will have to procure allowances. Now, what you will need to procure is called a Cbam certificate. The Cbam certificate is the financial mechanism that the EU Cbam will employ to attain its goals. I mentioned earlier we were talking about the EU ETS. I said the EU ETS uses what's called an EUA, the allowance, as the mechanism to force industry to pay for carbon. The mechanism that Cbam uses is a Cbam certificate. So let's talk about that for a minute. The Cbam certificate is not fungible. You cannot hedge it. You cannot trade it. And it also has a 2-year validity. So what that means is typically when a company is faced with an exposure like this, they like to hedge it or they like to mitigate risk. You cannot do that with Cbam. So that creates one problem right there for industry. This is an unavoidable risk. The second portion that makes this Cbam certificate quite expensive, it is directly correlated to an EUA. So right now I mentioned an EUA is around 55 euros. If I snap my finger and Cbam comes into full force today, a Cbam certificate would be 55 euros. Let's say tomorrow, one EUA jumps to 60 euros. An EU Cbam certificate would also follow to 60 euros. What this means is that the price of the EU ETS will now be encompassing anyone who wants to import into the EU. There's another caveat about this mechanism I want to touch on. That is the effective cost of carbon already paid, because the EU is aware that, well, there's more than just the EU ETS in the world when it comes to emissions trading systems and carbon taxes. We have places like South Korea, China, Australia, California, New York, the UK, the list goes on, of countries that are employing carbon taxes or emissions trading systems. So how do those interact with the Cbam? Well, the way they interact is through a rebate. I'll give you an example. REDSHAW advisors were located in London, and London is in the UK. In the UK, we have what's called the UK ETS, United Kingdom's emissions trading system. 1 ton of carbon, 1 UKA in the UK, is around 35 pounds. With exchange rate, let's call that 40 euros. I mentioned earlier, 1 ton of carbon in Europe is around 55 euros, right? So there's a delta, between 15 to 17 euros, depending on volatility at the time. So what EU Cbam is saying is if a good is already exposed to a carbon tax, I can take that carbon tax away from the final bill. So instead of paying 55 euros right now, I'd only pay 15. This is something that I want to note now, because we'll be coming back to it when it comes to Cbam's impact on Egypt. You can more or less break Cbam into two phases. First one is called the transitionary phase, where we are today. All you need to do today is to measure and to report. The EU is aware that what they are introducing is most likely the most comprehensive piece of climate and reporting requirements that most importers have ever faced in the EU. I would say 80% of our clients who I work with exposed to the EU Cbam are unable to comply right now. They are used to ISOs and GHG emission reporting that are much more conservative in the requirements compared to the EU Cbam. The EU Cbam is a significant reporting requirement that most companies and countries can't deal with right now. So that's why there's a transition period. Transition period is just try your best. Try and get those reports in, do your best. There are no financial penalties for the first few quarters, and there's no financial exposure until 2026. This is more or less the EU giving industry training wheels, letting them experiment. But that comes to an end in 2026. On January 1st, 2026, the EU Cbam will switch to what's called the definitive period. So transition period now, 2026, definitive period. This is when the financial bite of the EU Cbam will take place. To recap, right now it's 2024. All you need to do to enter the European market is to measure and to report your emissions. It's not impossible, but it's fairly achievable. 2026, you need to measure your emissions, report them, then verify them, meaning you need to fly some verifier out from Europe to go onto your installation, check all your valves with the clipboard, and make sure everything you report is proper. And then lastly, to procure, to buy those Cbam certificates. Those very, very expensive Cbam certificates. As I mentioned, 1 ton of carbon right now is 55 euros. However, the Cbam certificates don't come into full force immediately. Again, the EU is wise enough to know that if they introduced a strong cost of carbon right now, they would scare industry away. Most people wouldn't want to even attempt to go into Europe because it would be unprofitable. I mentioned earlier, we're anticipating 1 ton of cement to increase by 556% by 2034. The reason I said 2034 is when the phase-in reaches 100%. In 2026, the phase-in is only at 2.6%. So I want everyone to look at the red line on this graph. The red line shows the phase-in period. So let's have an example. Let's say, I'm going to pick on fertilizer here because I know fertilizer is a big sector here in Egypt. I'm a fertilizer exporter. I have 1 million tons of embedded emissions, just to make a nice round number. In 2026, I will only need to procure the embedded emissions for 2.5% of my million tons, so 25,000, right? If 1 EUA is worth 55 euros right now, times that by 25,000, ballpark of maybe a few million. I say only a few million because the costs we're going to talk about, you wish it was only a few million. Next is going to be 2030. That's when the phase-in reaches 50%. And finally, in 2034, the phase-in ends, and it is 100% exposure. So who are we talking about? Who needs to care about this? And on this slide, we put up 6 sectors, the initial 6 sectors exposed to the EU Cbam. However, it's quite deceiving, because not necessarily are these the sectors that need to care about Cbam. This is just the first phase of Cbam. So right now, we have 6 sectors. And again, that's also deceiving, because Cbam doesn't necessarily cover sectors. They cover CN codes, individual commodity codes. So iron and steel. If anyone's worked in iron and steel, you know there's a whole bunch of types of iron and steel. You have iron pellets, you have steel rods, you have alloy and non-alloy, you have everything in between. Currently, for the first Cbam phase, there's 749 CN codes exposed to Cbam. North of 600 are steel. So I'm looking around the stage right now. I'm holding a microphone. I guarantee there's metal parts in this microphone. Maybe there's a screw or a couple bolts in the speaker here. I'm looking at everything that, even though it might not seem like iron and steel, it might have iron and steel in it. We have a client of ours who exports pool tables, and the pool table has a handful of screws in it, and as a result of that, they have to comply with the EU Cbam now. So it's not just bulk goods, it's not just raw material, it's not just people who export clinker, it's people who probably are not even aware how small these CN codes have entered their portfolio, but the exposure range is quite wide and far. The second aspect I want to talk about is the expansion of Cbam. I mentioned right now, these 6 sectors are not the final 6 sectors. I'd actually, if I came back here in 2 years from now, in 2026, I would almost guarantee that these sectors would probably double by then. In Article 30, the EU Cbam, they specifically state things like organic chemicals, things like polymers, plastics. We also have a lot of rhetoric around sectors such as refining, glass, ceramics. The list goes on and on and on. REDSHAW Advisors has built a pretty comprehensive list of when we expect sectors to be included and exactly what specifically CN codes we anticipate will be included. If you're keen on seeing that, please reach out to me after this. All right, so we covered the story, why Cbam exists. We covered what Cbam is, how it operates. Let's get to the implications of Cbam. And this is going to be, personally, my favorite part, but for many of you, probably the part you're not too happy about. How much money you're going to have to pay for Cbam. So the first thing we need to look at is the blue line. The blue line shows the forward perspective, the forward forecasts of EUAs, European carbon. The way we've done this is we've aggregated 13 financial forecasts done typically through financial institutions into that blue line. So that's the medium. The red line is where carbon is today. And you can see that where it is today is not going to be there for a while. So right now, for example, going back to that Egyptian fertilizer example, let's say it's 2026. It's 1 million tons of embedded emissions that I have to procure Cbam certificates for. 2026, my phase-in rate is 2.5%. 2026, I am anticipating one EUA to be 109 euros. So again, call it maybe 3 to 4 million euros I'm going to have to buy on Cbam certificates. 2030, one EUA is around 150 euros, phase-in of 50%. That's about 75 million euros I will have to buy of carbon. So we went from 3 million in 2026 to north of or around 75 million in 2030. And then finally, in 2034, for 1 million tons of carbon, I will need to buy 250 million euros worth of carbon. Peter Lees, he's a member of the European Parliament. He said, I'm quoting him, he said, EU Cbam is the most important climate bill you've never heard of. This is going to revolutionize trade. There's going to be a lot of implications that this will cause on where commodities go and who we trade with. So let's start with the EU. 2021, they commissioned an assessment on what the EU Cbam would do to the economy. And I want to talk about some of the conclusions of this assessment. So first of all, as we all know, the EU is a net importer of nearly all of its raw material, from steel to clinker to aluminum, everything. So let's talk about supply and demand, right? First bullet point is a loss of 12% of imports. So we take a country, a bloc, that is a net importer of goods, and we take 12% away from that. What's going to happen to internal prices? What's going to happen to trade dynamics as a result of that? 12% is a considerable amount. 12% of steel gone from international imports. 12% of cement and clinker gone. And that's only in 2030. Similarly, EU exports don't fare too well. And this is why we've seen the EU Cbam be quite contentious in legal court, especially the World Trade Organization. Because if I'm Turkey and about half of my exports rely on the European market, if you're telling me I might lose 12% of that, I'm not going to be too happy. So for this presentation, we put together a case study of how the EU Cbam will impact Turkey and Egypt. The reason I included Turkey is because we want to talk about the future, not now. If Egypt's goal, which it is to export north of 100 billion euros each year, they're going to have to compete with their neighbors, folks like Algeria, Morocco, and Turkey. And Turkey right now is the big one on the street. Turkey exports more than any other MENA country. They hold the market, so let's compare them to that. If Egypt wants to compete, they need to compete against Turkey. So what we're going to do is we're going to line these two countries up. We're going to see who is exposed more to Cbam and how they're responding. Before we begin, all of these forecasts are indicative. What we have done, we've gone out to our clients in steel and aluminum, and I say, hey, Mr. Cement client, how much is 1 ton of clinker going to cost if I buy it from Turkey? And they give me a number. And we plug that number into our financial model, and then we can provide a forward curve of the EU Cbam certificate cost with a handful of other variables we provide. So Egypt. As of right now, Egypt isn't considerably exposed to the EU Cbam compared to other EU trading partners. But I want to focus on fertilizer, because fertilizer is one of the main sectors that Egypt prides itself on. It has a great fertilizer sector, and that's what I want to focus today's case study on. When it comes to Egypt's current share of exports into the EU, it's only around a quarter, which is quite minimal compared to some of the neighbors around here. However, we're not talking about 2024, we're talking about the future. One of our clients, I believe one of the largest cement exporters in Egypt, they're looking at about 2028 with the sole intention of how they can enter the European market. They're not even entered in the European market now, so that's why they're caring about Cbam. And this is why this slide right now, even though it's only showing 4% of cement exports into Egypt, or from Egypt to the EU, they're not concerned about that, they're concerned about the future. And that's what we want to talk about, which is how the EU Cbam is going to impact Egypt in the future. So to do this, we need to look at Egyptian emissions factors, because as of right now with Cbam, Cbam creates a cost for emissions. The higher emissions, the higher cost you pay. In Egypt, it's going to be a motif here, Egypt, like most of its North African neighbors, is quite emissions intensive. Now, taking a look at fertilizer, for example, Egyptian fertilizer is around 25% more carbon intensive than EU fertilizer. And so as a result of the EU Cbam, Egypt is going to have to buy 25% more carbon than its European counterparts. And if carbon is 140 euros a ton in 2030, 25% more is a whole heck of a lot more money. How much is quite considerable. So in this example, we took 100 tons of carbon exported from Egypt into the EU, and here are the figures we're talking about. And if anyone wants to take a picture, don't worry, the slides will be available for you afterwards for you to take a look at. So fertilizer, for example, for every 100,000 tons of fertilizer exported into the EU, there will be an additional cost of 12 million euros by 2030. And by 2034, that jumps to 40 million euros. So recently, as we all know, with the war in Ukraine, Ukraine used to be a significant fertilizer exporter of the world. And that supply has been shut away. And so that demand in Europe still is there. And so what Egypt has done is they've taken advantage of that demand, they filled that gap, and they've allowed themselves to have a good competitive advantage and attain market share. What we're looking at right now with Cbam is potentially that market share could be eaten away with the Cbam margins. In 2034, for example, if I tell a cement manufacturer that they might have 40% less margins in Europe, they might say, well, that's not the best, maybe we can live with that. If I tell a cement manufacturer that you'll have 556% margins, they're going to be out of business. This is why the EU Cbam is so important. Moving on, about how Egypt is responding. Now, I think this is the most important slide I want to talk about right now. The reason being is because this slide is going to be depending on if Egypt can enter the market or not enter the European market. So earlier, on my third slide, I talked about something called the effective cost of carbon. I mentioned that in the UK, we have the UK ETS, which is around 35 pounds, and in Europe, we have 55 euros of carbon. And we take the delta of that, and we subtract it. Egypt right now does not have a cost of carbon. They have no carbon tax, nor do they have an emissions trading system. So they would be fully exposed to the EU Cbam. Let's jump to 2034. If one Cbam certificate is 225 euros, Egypt would have to pay all of that if they want to export into the EU. But Egypt can do something about that. Egypt can employ an emissions trading system or a carbon tax, something that Turkey has already done, something that China, India, Japan, South Korea, basically, and even the US, basically every single one of Europe's major trading partners, either they're in consultations right now or has already employed a carbon tax or emissions trading system as a direct response to the EU Cbam. Egypt has not done that yet. Now, why does Egypt want to do that, though? The reason being is if Egypt, let's say, employs a carbon tax of 225 euros by 2034, what that means is the capital that carbon costs will go to Cairo and not Brussels. The money will be stopped in Egypt. And then Egypt can do whatever they want with that. Egypt could take that money and subsidize industry. Egypt can take that money and abate industry. They can do whatever they want with that money. And that's why, for example, Turkey is so ambitious and aggressive with getting their emissions trading systems locked in. Because they don't want that money to go to Europe. They want that money to stick in their borders. And the money we're talking is billions and billions and billions of euros. It's nothing to blink at. So let's talk about Turkey. Turkey is, for the most part, the elephant in the room for EU trade. Turkey leads as Europe's largest cement importer. Turkey is, I believe, the second largest steel importer into the EU and follows quite closely in other Cbam covered goods. Turkey is incredibly heavily exposed to the EU Cbam. When we talk about reliance of a market, what percent of its GDP is reliant on entering the EU market? Well, first country that comes to mind is Turkey. Turkey needs to access the European market to sell their goods. And that's going to be an issue for Turkey with Cbam. Turkey, for the most part, is probably one of the most carbon-intensive countries in this region. Region meaning MENA. Take aluminum, for example. Turkish aluminum is nearly 100% more carbon-intensive. So 1 EUA costs 55 euros. What this is telling me is for 1 ton of steel, maybe the EU producer has to buy 55 euros of carbon. The Turkish producer would have to buy 110 euros of carbon for the exact same volume of aluminum. The cost figures for Turkey are equally as nightmarish when it comes to the carbon costs. The most common conversation I'm having with my clients right now is sink or swim, as they say. They're looking at these forecasts and saying that's not profitable. We literally cannot do business in EU. This is maybe it's called 50 to 60% of their revenue is dependent on EU markets, and they're looking at this and they're doing their financial forecasts, and they cannot enter the EU market. So that's why I mentioned Turkey is so ambitious with their emissions trading system, because our clients, they go running to the Turkish emissions trading system authority, and they scream at them. They say, please give us an emissions trading system. Please give us a carbon tax. We need to protect our industry. And that's exactly what Turkey has done. Turkey has and is leading the way right now when it comes to MENA and introducing an emissions trading system. Although its pilot won't start until around 2025, we know much, much more about the Turkish ETS, and we've actually helped design it ourselves, REDSHAW advisors, than any other MENA carbon tax or emissions trading system. The reason they do this, once again, is because Turkey wants the money to stay in Turkey. They want their cement manufacturers to pay a carbon tax. You have to do it anyways. You have to pay the carbon tax. But what they can do is say the revenue stays in Istanbul and not goes to Brussels. And that's why it's so important for Egypt to get this message to act now. So how does Turkey fare when it comes to Egypt? Well, even with all these measures they're taking, they're still more carbon intensive. Turkey's up there nearly with India with how carbon intensive some of its industry is, especially aluminum and steel. But nonetheless, the EU is going to both affect them significantly. EU Cbam is both going to affect them significantly. Another aspect that we haven't even touched on is investment. So REDSHAW advisors, we work on behalf of a handful of very large financial institution and investment banks. And one of the topics that they're quite concerned about and what they want to talk about is, let's say they're building a new clinker plant, and they want to know where they should build it. Should I build it in Tunisia, in Morocco, in Turkey? Should I build it in the EU? How is Cbam going to impact that? How is Cbam going to impact my margins? And so if they're looking and they see Turkey has an emissions trading system that's coming up, they're more likely to make that investment in Turkey than they would, let's say, in Egypt. So now we're not just talking about existing industry within Egypt, we're talking about future investment, future capital. This is why it's so prudent and so pivotal right now for countries such as Egypt and Morocco and other dependents on the EU markets to understand this and move forward with an emissions trading system to protect their industry. So with that being said, I wanted to thank you very much. As you can probably tell, Cbam is not very white and black issue. If anyone's ever interested to have a discussion on how this policy could specifically impact their company, we're more than happy to build our financial models for your specific emission factors and your volumes complementary. So feel free to reach out if you'd like. But with that being said, if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take any. I would say sometime in 2025. So taking a look at Article 30 in specific about the EU Cbam, they specifically mention polymers as the next step when it comes to the expansion of the scope. Let's look at the UK Cbam. UK Cbam was announced around 2 months ago. In its initial assessment report, one of the areas they really focused on was adding polymers and plastics in. They came to the conclusion that as of right now, with technical feasibility, plastics are not necessarily there yet when it comes to our major import partners to be included. But just like the EU, they are anticipating for polymers to be included in the EU or in the UK Cbam in that case. So I would take the stance that sometime between 2025 to 2026, whenever the review report comes out, I would anticipate sectors such as plastics, polymers, and organic chemicals to be included in the EU Cbam.
تفضل.
Thank you for your presentation. Yes, I'm here. For my lucky, I am working in a fertilizers company. We are calculating our Cbam numbers. We export ammonia and urea. My questions: how can I know that my numbers is under reference, or I can decrease or increase? How can I know that I am good in the market? There is a benchmark or a companies calculate their numbers. I can compare myself with them?
Yeah, you can compare yourself with EU benchmarking. So there's something called the carbon leakage list that was released actually back in 2008. On this list, they update about every 4 years, is a benchmark for every single sector that they believe is exposed to carbon leakage. As of today, I believe the numbers are around 93% of all industrial emissions in Europe is on this list. So what I can do after this, if you want to get my card, I'm happy to send you that benchmarking of EURA. Now that's not a French-specific, it's an aggregated EU-specific benchmarking. It has the average EURA intensity, it has the 10% best, 10% worst, and I believe the abatement rate for that's average in the sector. So I'm more than happy to share that with you after this.
If I export a product that have a carbon credit, it can decrease our numbers?
Define carbon credits. So there is a carbon credit and a carbon allowance. Two very different things, apples and oranges. Our carbon credit is similar to like a voluntary carbon market credit. So maybe planting trees or maybe solar power and whatnot. That is excluded from Cbam. That will not decrease the cost of Cbam. The only way you can decrease the cost of your Cbam exposure is if, let's say, the Egyptian government incorporates an emissions trading system or a carbon tax for you that you are forced to participate in to pay that carbon. The other way is through abatement. Abatement is investing in actually decarbonization. So a good example of this, there's two main routes for steel that steel is made. The first route is the traditional blast furnace. The average emission intensity for that route is around 1.6 to 2.2%, or 2.2 tons per ton of steel made. The other route is called an electric arc furnace, EAF, which is around 4 times less carbon intensive than that initial blast furnace. So, for example, if a steel manufacturer would invest in that, they would decrease their overall emissions, therefore decreasing their Cbam bill. So those are the two main routes that a company can mitigate their cost.
Last questions. We used a calculation based in our calculate. If we we have a plan to use monitoring, until now we didn't do that.
Yeah. So what you're asking, in case anyone is unaware, for Scope 1 emissions, as I mentioned, the EU Cbam requires a completely new method. For Scope 1 emissions, they provide us with 5 different methodologies we could use. The first two are what's called the EU methods, calculation-based approach and measurement-based approach. The bottom 3 are temporary. One is default values, which has a quantitative limit of 20%, and the other 2 are temporary that will go away in about 6 or 7 months from now, January 31st, 2024. So what she's asking is, hey, right now we're using the first EU method, which is a calculation-based approach, which is what most companies use. It's the easiest. The second one is called the measurement-based approach. that uses a flue gas flow, which is fun to say, a flue gas flow that measures the embedded emissions in that production process. That's much more technical to put in, but depending on your specific production process, it can actually provide less emissions factors than the calculation-based approach. Now, I say that with a word of caution. There is probably maybe north of 70 different production processes in Cbam, and they're all different. Some favor calculation-based approach, some favor measurement-based approach. So I'd have to sit down with you to figure out specifically which emissions production process you use to answer that question. I'm more than happy to meet with you after this and discuss this further, though.
Well, then, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question. I was wondering why the Cbam is not tradable like the ETS. Why it's not open for non-European companies to be player in the market? So, for example, why can't companies in Egypt or in the MENA region can invest in abating and reducing and showing that, and instead of the Cbam being a risk, it can be as well an opportunity. If I can reduce emission enough, I can be able to trade and sell these in the European market.
So, just to recap, what you're saying is, if I'm an Egyptian company, why can't I go into the EU ETS and therefore have that effective cost of carbon paid? Is that kind of what you're saying? Great question. All right. So you can do that. In the EU ETS, it's unclear, but perhaps 20% of all allowances are held via speculators. A speculator is a non-EU entity, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, a hedge fund, companies that speculate in the market to make a profit. So they're not exposed to the EU ETS, but they still buy carbon credits for profit, not just for, sadly, not just for climate change. So there's nothing stopping you to enter the market voluntarily. However, the EU ETS would not want that because it's not designed to do that. The EU ETS, I would argue, is the world's most unique market. The reason it's unique is it's called a cap and trade market. Cap, because there's an absolute number of allowances. There's a cap in the market. The cap is calculated on total emission factors of the entire EU bloc. That's a very sensitive number, right? And so if they open the door and let industry of the world come in, it would be impossible to measure that cap. This cap has something called a linear reduction factor that every single year it declines. And as a result of that, it has to be very carefully monitored, and they need to have a very carefully understanding amount of who's exposed, how many emissions, and something called the TNAC, total number of allowances in circulation. And so all of these numbers come in to actually make the cap in itself. So it's a very unique equation that if you allow every company in the world to enter, that equation would disappear. And so that's why we have different types of emissions trading systems. We have the UK ETS, which has its own cap, its own basically currency. It's called a UKA. That's what's around 35 pounds. In North America, we have REDSHAW, which encompasses around 163 power plants in the Northeast. We have the California cap, which is another cap and trade market. We have Chinese ETS, Indian ETS. We have all these different emissions systems popping up because they have to only encompass their region, because only they know the emissions intensity of that region. Otherwise, it would be impossible to make a very accurate cap, and without an accurate cap, there is no incentive for abatement. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not. Perfect.
تفضل.
And welcome to Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh. I want to ask you about the benchmarking for CO2 figures for iron and steel. It will be divided by route, BF and DRI, EF, DRI, or something like this. How it will be decreased, the limit will be decreased within the next few years. I want to please to provide me if there is certain figures for this. The second question, can I complete or?
Please go, yeah, go.
The second question about the calculation base. We use the template published by EU.
The EU, yep.
Yeah, EU template. And Already some calculation were done and provided to our client in EU. But we suffer a problem. The CO2 emission delivered by the purchased companies, the purchased good from companies. It will be late than the declaration period. I think I know that upon July 24, yep, it will be not permitted to use the default values.
That's correct.
Yes. How can I overcome this problem?
So what he's asking right now is saying, hey, we submitted our first report, we used default values. Default values is the European Commission saying, hey, we know these calculation-based approach and measurement-based approach are really, really complex. So we're just going to assign emissions factors for different commodity codes. So clinker just has one commodity code, about 0.87 per tons of emission per ton of clinker. But that's not necessarily accurate, because you take 100 different clinker productions, and maybe one is at 7.8, one's upwards of 1.9 or something. They just take the average. But the EC doesn't want to take the average. They want companies to accurately measure their own emissions. So what this gentleman is saying is, we got the default value, that was fine, but after July 31st, 2024, default values go away. Completely, they have a quantitative limit of 20%, meaning that that gentleman would have to undergo a much more rigorous exercise to attain the calculation or measurement-based approach of the emissions to comply with Cbam. The answer is something I'd probably say to most clients who give me a very similar question, which is this is most likely going to be, if not the hardest compliance requirement your company will be faced, it will be one of the hardest. Maybe 1 out of 3 companies we work with almost give up on the EU. We train them on the EU Cbam. They sit there for 8 hours, and at the end they say it's too hard for us. And I'm not saying that's you, sir. I'm just saying a lot of organizations we work with look at this, and they say, we need to hire a team of like 10 people to comply with the EU Cbam. And for now, they give up. The EU has, in my eyes, EU has provided a requirement that is almost too high for most companies to attain. To attain the calculation-based approach for Scope 1 emissions takes a considerable amount. I joke you need an Oxford math degree sometimes to attain these numbers, and you only have 6 months to do this. July 31st, 2024, default values have a 20% quantitative limit, forcing companies to use EU methodologies. What happens if they can't find that methodology? They get fined. Fined between 10 to 50 euros, depending on unreported or misreported tons. So let's say it's August. Let's say I did my darndest to get that report in, and I used everything I have to use a calculation-based approach, and I just couldn't do it correctly. The EU might deliver a bill of 10 to 50 euros, depending on which national state you're working with, per ton of carbon that's misreported. So 1 million tons of carbon or 100 tons of carbon, that could be a considerable bill. And so not only is it difficult, it's difficult with a very steep consequence, which is that non-compliance fee. The first question, if I'm correct, it was something along the lines of, hey, you know, steel's quite dirty, 1.6% around. How do we abate steel? Abating means how do we decarbonize steel? Steel is tricky. Steel and cement are probably arguably the 2 hardest sectors to abate. When I look at steel, I think of 3 routes. First route is hydrogen, very expensive. Second route is CCS, not really profitable yet. Most CCS units that have been completed, in Europe at least, are done through government subsidies. I can't think of a single client of ours that hasn't completed a CCS without a very generous fund from the European Commission. So that's an option, but maybe not now. Maybe it's not financially viable now, but maybe along the way it will be. The last route is the hardest. The last route is transforming from blast furnace to electric arc furnace. If anyone had read the news in the last 6 months about Tata Steel, you would have read about a gigantic closure of the largest steel plant in the UK called Port Talbot. Port Talbot was a blast furnace steel manufacturing route that paid over 100+ million easily a year on carbon, something that's just not profitable anymore. So Tata Steel went to the UK government and said, look, we can't pay this carbon, it's too high, help us please. And so the UK government gave them a $500 million pound grant to build a EAF plant that's going to be online in the coming years. So all of these routes are very expensive, and sadly, most of them cannot be attained without government subsidies, which takes me back to the main points of this session, which is Egypt needs to take a look at this to say, how can we be competitive? And the reason you can be competitive is by incorporating a carbon tax and an emissions trading system, taking that capital and doing what the UK did, which is investing it in industry to help them decarbonize. Invest it provide grants for CCS units, provide grants for decarbonizing steel and aluminum, and especially fertilizer. And that can't happen without an emissions trading system or a carbon tax. I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but the time to act was about 2 years ago, because most of your competition, including Turkey, are well established. There's still a window to operate. We're still in the transition period. And REDSHAW advisors, last week we were talking with the Indian government about this. So you're not in the same boat. There's countries like India that are still, a bit up in the air. But even India is engaging in consultations. We're meeting with them. We're helping them build an ETS. From our research on Egypt, conversations have been had, but there's not been any concrete movement yet. So that's what I would take as my main takeaway is to mitigate, you need government help. Government help comes with an emissions trading system.
سؤال أخير دكتور أحمد اتفضل.
Thanks a lot for the nice presentation. Definitely very, very useful and important. Two questions. The first of all is regarding the European consumer. How much he can pay for the taxes, because in the end, the EU still will import the steel, the cement, and so on. And if the exporter, like an Egyptian plant, for example, is going to export his product, it will be with a higher price. So can the European consumer really pay the difference? I think usually the economics is the one which drives everything. The second question for Egypt, we have a lot of CERs, certified emission reductions from CDM projects.
Yep.
As you know, of course, these projects are very, very well verified and very high quality certificates. So
I disagree with that.
Do you think, or is it possible that Egypt can just use these certificates to pay for the Cbam certificates? Thank you.
Great questions, first of all. So I'll answer your second question first. CDM projects. Anyone who doesn't know, CDM stands for the Clean Development Mechanism. It was orchestrated by the UN. CDM projects provided a route for climate revenue to enter the carbon markets. It was a wonderful, wonderful initiative that sadly was taken advantage from a lot of companies who did not uphold the integrity. As a result, CDM projects are not well viewed and are typically the voluntary carbon credits that are most commonly labeled as greenwashing. When it comes to CERs in specific, the EU ETS back in phase 2 and phase 3 actually included CERs in its system. Phase 4, they excluded them. Going back to the integrity, the EU decided, someone can find this, between 2012 and 2014, around then, the EU decided that CERs were not valid and not integral when it comes to what they were designed to do. So they've already set the precedent that CERs would not be applicable for the EU ETS. If the EU Cbam is designed on the EU ETS, we can conclude that CERs would not be viable for the EU Cbam. And then most of my clients say, well, Dan, a CER is $2, $3, but an EUA is 55 euros. I want to buy the cheap one. And of course they do. They want to save money. But if the EU Cbam let open the door to unintegral credits that are cheap, the integrity of the EU Cbam would degrade. I'm happy to send you an article on this actually afterwards, this exact topic, which is, should VCM credits be included in Cbam? We can discuss that after. The first question, you mentioned, I'll repeat it. How high does the tax need to be for it to be more or less attainable and really make an effective mitigation for Cbam? Is that more or less what your question was? If you could repeat it. I think I'm getting old. I couldn't hear you too well. From what I could hear, though, maybe take a step back, right? So when we talk about Cbam, I want everyone to know it's not just the European Union. Cbam will not be known as the EU policy. It will be the world policy. As we speak today, the US, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and the UK, and many other developing countries are talking about incorporating a Cbam. Next week, I'm heading to Singapore to meet with Frank Jotso. Frank is leading the Australian Cbam consultation. Australia most likely will have a Cbam. So look at Egypt, who you export to, right? I know it's not just the EU now. Do you export to the US? Well, I would put money on the table. The US most likely, with the rhetoric they said, especially from Senator Chris Kramer, they will have a type of Cbam. So the cost that you need to incur on your industry isn't just for Europe. You have to take in consideration what the cost might be to have access to the US market and to the UK market. Probably not the Australia market. I don't know how much Egypt exports to Australia. But it's the rolling of the tide. If all these developed countries are going to have a Cbam, what about Saudi Arabia? What about Turkey? Turkey has an ETS. They need to protect that carbon leakage just as the EU ETS needs to protect its carbon leakage. So why wouldn't Turkey have a Cbam? So all of these countries are going to be rising a Cbam up. So to answer your question, what I want to say is put that cost as high as possible. Keep the money in Egypt, not just protecting it against the EU Cbam, but the rest of the world coming up and creating Cbams. Again, I'm not sure if that's exactly your question. I'd love to meet you afterwards and we can discuss this further if you'd like.